The towering red sandstone formations of Monument Valley stood witness to many stories, but few as remarkable as this one. September 1876. A lone woman, unable to speak since birth, cast away from a pioneer wagon train for being cursed. Left to die in the unforgiving desert until fate placed her in the path of a Navajo chief who saw not a burden, but a person worth saving, even if it meant risking everything. What followed would challenge the deepest prejudices of the American frontier and prove that sometimes the most profound connections form in silence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The setting sun painted the Arizona Territory sky with brilliant streaks of orange and purple as the Hartman wagon train made camp in the shadow of Copper Canyon. 24 settlers from Pennsylvania had joined together 4 months earlier. With dreams of fertile farmland and new beginnings in California's lush Central Valley, Hannah Reed sat alone at the edge of camp, her slender fingers moving nimbly across a small piece of leather, etching intricate patterns with a bone needle. At 22, she possessed striking features, intelligent hazel eyes that observed everything, high cheekbones, and dark chestnut hair that fell in waves past her shoulders. But Hannah had been born without the ability to speak, a condition that had shaped her entire existence. From her position slightly removed from the others, she could observe the entire camp. Wagons arranged in their protective circle, cook fires flickering to life, the familiar sounds of metal cookware and conversation filling the early evening air. The voices around her created a tapestry of sound she would never contribute to, yet she understood every word, every inflection, every unspoken meaning behind what was said. Her aunt, Martha Reed, a stern-faced woman in her 50s who had reluctantly become Hannah's guardian after her parents died of fever 5 years earlier, stirred a pot of stew near the family's wagon. "Hannah!" Martha called sharply, gesturing with her wooden spoon. "Come help with supper. Make yourself useful for once." Hannah tucked her leatherwork into the pocket of her worn calico dress and hurried to assist, accustomed to Martha's constant reminders that she was a burden. Her cousin Eliza, Martha's daughter who was a year younger than Hannah, smirked slightly as Hannah approached. "Mother, I don't think she heard you," Eliza said, loudly enough for others nearby to hear. "Maybe she's simple, in the head as well as mute." Several of the younger women giggled, and Hannah felt her cheeks burn with familiar humiliation. Though Hannah couldn't speak, her mind was sharp. She had taught herself to read and write by observing her cousin's lessons. She communicated through gestures and by writing when paper was available, which Martha rarely allowed, claiming it was a waste. The journey west had been particularly difficult, with many of the settlers viewing her silence as something unnatural or even sinister. Thomas Hartman, the wagon master, a burly man with a salt and pepper beard and weather-beaten face, approached the Reed wagon. "We'll be crossing into Navajo territory tomorrow," he announced to Martha. 3 days to reach the trading post at Silver Creek if we make good time." Martha's face tightened with worry. "Is it safe? We've heard stories." "Keep to the established trail and respect their boundaries," Hartman replied, his voice carrying enough for the nearby wagons to hear. "The Navajo aren't looking for trouble. The army's been pushing them hard enough as it is." His eyes fell on Hannah, who was efficiently slicing dried vegetables into the pot. Unlike many in the wagon train, Hartman had always treated her with basic decency. "The girl holding up all right?" he asked Martha, as though Hannah weren't present. Before Martha could answer, Eliza interjected. "She's been even stranger lately, wandering off, collecting odd things. Mother found a bundle of feathers and bones under her bedroll yesterday." Hannah's hands stilled. The small objects she'd collected, a raven's feather, a uniquely shaped stone, the shed antler tip of a deer, were her private treasures, Small beauties in a world that offered her little kindness. Probably learned witchcraft from that. Old woman back in Tucson, added James Reed, Martha's husband, as he joined the conversation. A thin man with cold eyes, he had made no secret of his resentment at being saddled with his brother's mute daughter. She spent too long with that Mexican healer woman when we stopped for supplies. Hannah kept her eyes lowered, continuing her work. The elderly curandera in Tucson had been the only person to show her genuine kindness in months. The woman had recognized something in Hannah, not a deficiency, but a different kind of awareness. She had pressed a small medicine pouch into Hannah's hand and shown her how certain plants could heal, all communicated through gestures and demonstration. "I don't like it," Martha declared. "It's not natural, a grown woman unable to speak. The good Lord marks the afflicted for a reason." Hartman shifted uncomfortably. "The girl works hard enough. Leave her be." He nodded once to Hannah, who acknowledged him with a quick glance, then moved on to speak with the other families. Later that night, as most of the camp settled into sleep, Hannah lay awake on her thin bedroll beside the wagon. The canvas sheet separating her sleeping area from her aunt's family provided the only privacy she'd known for months. Through a small gap, she could see the stars wheeling overhead, vast and silent like herself. She reached beneath her blanket and removed the small leather-wrapped bundle the curandera had given her. Inside was a collection of dried herbs and a small carved figure, a woman with her hands raised to the sky. The old healer had pressed it to Hannah's throat, then to her heart, her weathered hands communicating what words could not. A flicker of movement at the edge of camp caught her attention. Hannah carefully shifted to peer into the darkness beyond the wagons. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure on horseback, silhouetted against the distant cliffs, watching their camp. Then it was gone, melting into the night like a shadow. The next morning dawned clear and crisp. The wagon train set out early, hoping to reach a reliable water source by midday. Hannah rode in the back of her aunt's wagon, using the travel time to continue her leather work, a pair of moccasins she was making in secret, inspired by designs she had seen in trading posts along their journey. As the morning wore on, the trail narrowed, forcing the wagons to travel single file through a winding canyon. Hannah noticed Hartman growing increasingly tense, his eyes scanning the high ridges above them. The canyon walls pressed close on either side, creating natural echoes that made every sound seem magnified. The creak of wagon wheels, the snort of oxen, the nervous chatter of the settlers. "Keep close formation," Hartman called back to the line of wagons. "We're passing through a narrow stretch." Hannah felt it before anyone else, a subtle change in the air, a tension that prickled along her skin. She set aside her work and moved to the edge of the wagon, peering ahead. Something wasn't right. The birds had gone silent. From her position, she saw Hartman suddenly rein in his horse, his hand moving to the rifle strapped to his saddle. Too late, he shouted a warning as the first arrow struck the lead wagon's canvas cover. Chaos erupted instantly. Not Navajo raiders, as many immediately assumed, but white men disguised with war paint and feathers, firing from the ridge above. Hannah recognized their leader immediately, Wilson Fletcher, a scout who had traveled with them briefly before being dismissed by Hartman for stealing supplies. He had sworn revenge, and now he had returned with a band of outlaws. "This is for cheating me of my pay, Hartman," Fletcher shouted as he fired his revolver, striking the wagon master in the shoulder. The settlers scrambled for cover and weapons. James Reed grabbed his rifle and pushed Martha and Eliza toward the shelter of a large boulder. "Get to cover!" he shouted. In the confusion, no one noticed that Hannah remained in the wagon, momentarily frozen as she watched the attack unfold. The wagon lurched violently as the oxen, spooked by gunfire, suddenly bolted. Hannah was thrown against the wooden side as the vehicle careened forward, breaking away from the train. She clung desperately to the frame as the wagon picked up speed, bouncing dangerously over the uneven terrain. Ahead, the trail curved sharply along a steep embankment. Hannah saw the danger too late. The panicked oxen couldn't make the turn. The wagon tilted, teetered on the edge for one terrifying moment, then toppled sideways. Hannah was thrown clear, her body tumbling down the rocky slope in a shower of loose stones and dust. Pain exploded through her as she collided with the canyon. Floor, the world spinning into darkness around her. When consciousness returned, the first thing Hannah registered was silence. No gunshots, no screams, no wagon wheels, just the soft whistle of wind through the canyon. Pain radiated from her left leg and side. She tried to move and nearly blacked out again from the intensity of it. Blood matted her hair where her head had struck a rock. How long had she been unconscious? The sun had moved significantly in the sky. Hours must have passed. From her position at the bottom of a narrow ravine, she couldn't see the trail above or what had happened to the wagon. Train? Had anyone seen her fall? Would they come looking? The bitter truth settled over her like a cold shadow. Even if they had survived the attack, her aunt's family might consider her loss a blessing rather than a tragedy. Martha had made it clear many times that Hannah was an unwanted responsibility, a burden they carried only out of reluctant family obligation. With tremendous effort, Hannah pulled herself to a sitting position. Her left ankle was swollen and discolored, possibly broken. Various cuts and bruises covered her arms, and a particularly deep gash on her right forearm still seeped blood. The medicine pouch, remarkably, remained tied around her neck, having somehow stayed with her during the fall. The ravine offered no shelter, and the September sun beat down mercilessly. Without water, Hannah knew she wouldn't survive long. She needed to find shade at minimum, water if possible. Gritting her teeth against the pain, she began to crawl, using her arms to drag herself toward a shallow overhang in the canyon wall about 20 yards away. Each movement was agony. Twice she had to stop, breathing heavily as spots danced before her eyes. By the time she reached the meager shelter, her dress was torn and filthy, her hands bloody from the rough terrain. In the narrow strip of shade, Hannah leaned back against the cool stone wall. She untied the medicine pouch with trembling fingers and emptied its contents. Among the herbs was a small piece of cactus flesh that the curandera had included. Hannah remembered the woman pantomiming how to use it. The juice could help with thirst. She carefully scraped away the spines and placed a small piece in her mouth, grateful for even this minimal moisture. As the afternoon wore on, Hannah drifted in and out of consciousness. The temperature dropped rapidly as the sun sank toward the horizon, the desert's extreme variations asserting themselves. She huddled against the rock, shivering, her injuries throbbing in time with her heartbeat. In the gathering twilight, Hannah became aware of a presence. Opening her eyes, she saw a figure on horseback at the edge of the ravine, silhouetted against the crimson sky. For a moment, she thought it might be one of Fletcher's men, returning to ensure no survivors remained. She pressed herself tighter. Against the rock, though she had nowhere to hide, the rider dismounted with fluid grace and began descending into the ravine, moving with deliberate care over the loose stones. As he drew closer, Hannah could make out his appearance. A tall man with copper skin and long black hair tied with a silver-decorated leather band. He wore buckskin leggings and a blue trade-cloth shirt beneath a woven blanket draped over. One shoulder, not one of Fletcher's outlaws, but a Navajo man. From his bearing and the quality of his attire, someone of importance within his tribe. He approached cautiously, hands visible to show he meant no harm. His dark eyes took in her injuries with a quick, assessing glance. Hannah remained still, uncertain whether his arrival meant salvation or further danger. The man knelt a respectful distance away, speaking words in a language Hannah didn't understand. When she didn't respond, he switched to heavily accented English. "You are hurt. From the wagons." He gestured toward the trail above. Hannah nodded, then pointed to her throat and shook her head, trying to communicate her inability to speak. Understanding dawned in his eyes. He nodded once, then pointed to himself. "Ashki, dig in." He touched his chest, then made a gesture that seemed to indicate leadership or authority. "Chief." He pointed to her questioningly. Hannah wished desperately for a way to tell him her name. She glanced around, then awkwardly traced letters in the dusty ground with her finger. H-A-N-N-A-H. Ashki studied the letters, then looked at her with new interest. "Hannah," he pronounced it carefully, showing respect for her communication. "Bad men attack wagons, many dead. You fall?" He gestured toward the embankment. She nodded, then pointed upward and made a circular motion with her finger, asking about the wagon train. "Gone." He made a continuing motion with his hand. "Some live, continue west." The implications hit Hannah like a physical blow. The survivors had moved on without searching for her. Her aunt and uncle had abandoned her, probably, assuming she was dead, or perhaps not caring either way. Tears welled in her eyes, despite her effort to hold them back. Ashki watched her face with quiet understanding, allowing her this moment of realization without intrusion. Then he spoke again, his voice gentle but firm. "Night comes. Cold. Coyotes." He gestured to her injuries. "Need help." Hannah hesitated. She had grown up hearing terrible stories about the savage Indians who supposedly tortured captives, but the man before her had made no threatening moves, and his eyes held nothing but concern. What choice did she have? Stay and certainly die, or trust this stranger and possibly live? Ashki seemed to read her thoughts. He reached slowly into a pouch at his waist and offered her a strip of dried meat and a small water skin. The simple kindness, offering sustenance before anything else, decided her. Hannah accepted both gratefully, taking small sips of the precious water. "My people camp near. Medicine woman can help." He pointed to her injured leg. "I carry you?" Hannah nodded, bracing herself for the pain movement would bring. Ashki carefully lifted her, mindful of her injuries, and carried her up the ravine to where his horse waited. With gentle efficiency, he settled her on the animal's back, then mounted behind her, one arm securely around her waist to keep her from falling. As they rode away from the ravine, Hannah looked back once at the scattered contents of the wagon. Visible in the fading light, broken wheels, splintered wood, her aunt's prized china doll shattered against the rocks. The physical remnants of her old life already being reclaimed by the desert. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Twilight faded into darkness as Ashki guided his horse through terrain that would have been impassable to the heavy wagons. Hannah struggled to remain conscious, each rhythmic movement of the horse sending fresh waves of pain through her injured body. The medicine pouch around her neck bounced lightly against her collarbone, a small reminder of kindness in a world that had shown her little. "Stay awake," Ashki said, his voice cutting through her fog of pain. "Not far now." Hannah forced her eyes open, focusing on the landscape illuminated by the rising moon. They traveled through a hidden valley, following what appeared to be a game trail visible only to Ashki's experienced eye. Massive rock formations loomed against the star-filled sky, their silhouettes resembling sleeping giants keeping watch over the land. After what seemed like hours, but was perhaps only one, Hannah detected the faint scent of wood smoke. Soon, the soft glow of campfires appeared ahead, nestled in a protected basin surrounded by towering sandstone cliffs. As they drew closer, she could make out the distinctive shapes of hogans, traditional Navajo dwellings made of logs and earth Arranged in a circular pattern, several figures emerged from the nearest structures as Ashki approached. He called out in Navajo, his words unintelligible to Hannah but clearly explaining the situation. The response was immediate. An elderly woman hurried forward, already issuing instructions that sent others scrambling to prepare. Ashki dismounted carefully, then gently lifted Hannah from the horse. The sudden movement caused darkness to swirl at the edges of her vision. She felt herself being carried into one of the larger hogans, where a fire burned in a central pit, filling the space with warmth and flickering light. The floor was covered with woven rugs in intricate patterns. Ashki laid her down on what appeared to be a sleeping pallet prepared with soft blankets. The elderly woman, Ashki referred to her as Shimasani, which Hannah would later learn meant my grandmother, knelt beside her, examining her injuries with practiced hands. Shimasani's weathered face reminded Hannah of the curandera in Tucson, the same knowing eyes, the same quiet competence. The woman spoke softly to Ashki, who translated for Hannah's benefit. "She asks if you have pain here," he said, indicating Hannah's ribs where Shimasani's fingers gently probed. Hannah nodded, wincing. "And your head? Dizziness?" Another nod. The examination continued methodically, with Ashki translating questions and Hannah responding as best she could through gestures and expressions. Her ankle received particular attention, Shimasani's practiced fingers detecting the break that Hannah had suspected. A younger woman entered, carrying clay bowls of water and various pouches of what Hannah guessed were medicinal herbs. She had features similar to Ashki's, the same high cheekbones and dignified bearing, though her eyes held wariness as she regarded the white woman in their dwelling. "My sister Nijoni," Ashki explained, noting Hannah's questioning look. "She helps Shimasani with healing." Shimasani mixed various dried plants into a paste, speaking continuously in a low melodic tone that somehow eased Hannah's anxiety. Despite the language barrier, the medicine woman applied the mixture to Hannah's cuts and abrasions, including the deep gash on her arm. The initial sting gave way to a numbing sensation that brought blessed relief. For the broken ankle, Shimasani prepared splints from smoothed pieces of cedar, binding them in place with strips of soft cloth. Her movements were gentle but firm, her technique refined through decades of treating injuries far from any doctor's office. Throughout the process, Hannah noticed something unexpected. The Navajo healer seemed completely untroubled by her inability to speak. Unlike the settlers who had viewed her silence as frightening or unnatural, Shimasani treated it as simply another aspect of who Hannah was, neither defining nor diminishing her. When Shimasani finished, she prepared a tea from some of the herbs, adding honey to mask what Hannah suspected was a bitter taste. She mimed drinking, then sleeping, making her instructions clear without needing translation. The tea was indeed bitter despite the honey, but Hannah drank it dutifully. Almost immediately, a soothing warmth spread through her, dulling the sharp edges of her pain. Her eyelids grew heavy, the day's trauma and exhaustion finally catching up with her. As she drifted toward sleep, she was vaguely aware of Ashki speaking with Shimasani and Nijoni in hushed tones. The last thing she registered was a soft blanket being placed over her and the comforting crackle of the fire. Hannah dreamed of falling, tumbling endlessly through space, unable to cry out. Just before hitting bottom, she jerked awake, disoriented, and momentarily panicked until her surroundings came into focus. Sunlight filtered through the smoke hole in the Hogan's roof, indicating it was well into morning. She was alone in the dwelling, the fire now reduced to glowing embers. Her injuries throbbed dully, but the sharp, immediate pain of the previous day had subsided to a more manageable ache. The medicine woman's treatments had clearly helped, though Hannah knew she was far from healed. Moving carefully to avoid jarring her ribs or ankle, she pushed herself up to a sitting position. Her dress, torn and blood-stained from the fall, had been removed while she slept. In its place, she wore a long cotton garment similar to a nightgown, the fabric softer than anything she'd worn during the harsh months of travel. A clay cup of water sat within reach beside the pallet. Hannah drank gratefully, her parched throat a reminder of yesterday's ordeal. As she set the empty cup down, the Hogan's door covering was pushed aside. Nijoni entered, carrying a wooden tray with some kind of porridge and more of the medicinal tea. The young woman's expression remained guarded, though less openly suspicious than the previous night. She knelt gracefully beside Hannah and set down the tray, then pointed to the food and pantomimed eating. Hannah nodded her thanks, accepting the simple wooden bowl. The porridge was unfamiliar, a blue cornmeal preparation sweetened with berries, but delicious after nearly a day without proper food. As she ate, Nijoni watched her with undisguised curiosity. When Hannah finished, Nijoni took the bowl and offered her the tea. Then, to Hannah's surprise, she pointed to her own mouth and made a questioning gesture, clearly asking about Hannah's muteness. Hannah touched her throat and shook her head, then mimed being born that way. Understanding dawned in Nijoni's eyes. She nodded thoughtfully, then pointed to herself and made a similar gesture to her ears, then indicated partial hearing. The simple exchange created an unexpected connection between them. Nijoni had partial deafness, not the same as Hannah's condition, but enough that she understood what it meant to navigate the world with different abilities. Their silent communication was interrupted by Ashki's arrival. He carried something wrapped in a soft cloth, which he presented to Hannah. "For writing," he explained, unfolding the package to reveal a small slate and piece of chalk, precious items in this remote place, likely obtained through trade with settlers or at a distant trading post. Hannah's eyes widened in surprise and gratitude. No one in the wagon train had ever thought to provide her with regular means of communication, despite knowing she could write. Yet this man, a stranger from a completely different culture, had recognized her need immediately. She took the slate and wrote carefully, "Thank you for everything." Ashki nodded, the simple acknowledgement more meaningful than effusive words might have been. "How do you feel today?" Hannah wrote. "Better. Still pain, but less." "Good. Shimasani's medicine is strong." He settled on a woven mat opposite her. "We must talk about what happens now." Hannah tensed, uncertain what this meant. Was he planning to send her away, demand payment she couldn't provide? The familiar anxiety of being unwanted, a burden to be managed, crept back into her thoughts. Ashki must have read the apprehension in her face. "You are safe here," he assured her quickly. "But there are things you should know," he explained. That the attack on the wagon train had not been an isolated incident. Similar raids had occurred throughout the territory in recent months. White outlaws, disguised as Navajo or Apache, deliberately stoking conflict between settlers and native peoples. With each attack, retaliatory violence against innocent tribes increased. "The army blames us for these attacks," Ashki said, his expression grave. "They pressure our people to move to reservation land far from here, land that cannot support our way of life." Hannah wrote, "The man who led the attack, Fletcher, traveled with our train before, not Navajo." Ashki's eyes narrowed with interest. "You saw him clearly. Would know him again?" She nodded emphatically. "This is important information, evidence that might help my people." He fell silent for a moment, considering the implications. But dangerous knowledge. Fletcher and his men would kill to keep such truths hidden. Hannah hadn't considered this aspect of her survival. She had witnessed what Fletcher desperately needed to conceal, that he was framing the Navajo for his crimes. This made her both valuable and vulnerable. She wrote on the slate, "What about the wagon train survivors?" "They continued west yesterday morning. Army patrol found them, provided escort to nearest settlement." Ashki's tone grew careful. "Your family was among the survivors." Hannah's hand tightened around the chalk. Did they look for me? Ashki hesitated, clearly weighing truth against kindness. The woman claimed you died in the initial attack. She seemed certain. The words struck Hannah like a physical blow. Martha hadn't even admitted Hannah might have survived, hadn't requested any search. She had seized the opportunity to be free of her unwanted niece. The depth of this rejection, despite years of enduring Martha's coldness, still managed to hurt. "They won't come back for me," she wrote, the chalk shaking slightly in her grip. "No," Ashki confirmed gently, "they will not." Hannah sat with this reality, letting it settle over her. She had suspected as much, but confirmation brought both pain and, unexpectedly, a strange sense of release. The fragile thread connecting her to the Reed family had finally snapped clean, leaving her truly alone. But also, perhaps, free to forge a different path. After giving her a moment to process this information, Ashki continued, "You are welcome. Among us while you heal. Shimasani says your ankle needs at least a moon cycle to mend properly, a month among the Navajo." The prospect should have terrified her, given everything she'd been taught to believe about savage Indians. Instead, Hannah felt an unexpected sense of relief. These people had shown her more kindness in one day than she'd received during months with the wagon train. "What happens after I heal?" she wrote. "That," Ashki said with unexpected gentleness, "is for you to decide when the time comes." As he spoke, Nijoni returned with Shimasani. The elderly medicine woman carried fresh bandages and more of her healing paste. She shooed Ashki out with good-natured authority, clearly indicating it was time for Hannah's treatments. Before leaving, Ashki paused at the doorway. "Rest today. Tomorrow, if you are stronger, I will show you our camp. My people should know who stays among them." As Shimasani began changing the bandage on Hannah's arm with nimble fingers, Hannah reflected on the unexpected turn her life had taken. 24 hours ago, she had been the scorned, silent burden of a reluctant family, surrounded by people yet profoundly alone. Now she found herself among strangers who nevertheless offered her something she had rarely experienced, the dignity of being treated as a person of value. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had finally found a voice of sorts in the last place. Anyone would have expected, among people whose language she couldn't even speak. The next 3 days passed in a rhythm of healing and rest. Hannah's strength gradually returned as Shimasani's treatments worked their subtle magic. The deep gash on her arm began to close cleanly. Her ribs ached less when she breathed, and though her ankle remained immobilized, the throbbing had subsided to a dull discomfort. On the 4th morning, Ashki appeared with a walking stick carved from petrified wood, its surface polished to a warm glow. "Time you see more than the inside of this hogan," he said, offering her the stick and his arm for support. Hannah had been dressed that morning in clothing Nijoni had brought, a long cotton dress in the settler style, likely obtained through trade, but modified with Navajo embroidery around the collar and cuffs. The garment was loose enough to accommodate her bandages while preserving her modesty. With Ashki's help, she managed to stand, testing her weight cautiously on her good leg. Moving was painful but possible. The slate and chalk remained her constant companions, tucked into a small pouch that hung from her waist. Together, they emerged into the crisp morning air. The Navajo encampment spread before her, nestled in its protective basin of red sandstone. Hannah counted over 20 hogans, arranged in a rough circle, with gardens of corn, beans and squash, cultivated in the fertile soil near a small stream that bisected the settlement. Children played near the water's edge, their laughter carrying across the camp. Women worked at outdoor looms, creating the intricate blankets for which the Navajo were renowned, while others ground corn or tended to cooking fires. It was a scene of everyday life that contradicted everything Hannah had been told about wild Indians. This was a settled community with clear social structures, productive work, and domestic tranquility. People paused in their activities as Ashki slowly guided Hannah through the camp. Some watched with open curiosity, others with more guarded expressions. A few older men nodded respectfully to Ashki, whose bearing suggested his authority within the community extended beyond just the title chief he had used to identify himself. "This is our summer camp," he explained as they walked. "When winter comes, we move to the protected valleys to the south, where snow is less deep and hunting better." Hannah noticed that Ashki did not rush their progress, allowing her to observe each aspect of camp life. He seemed intent on showing her that his people lived with purpose and dignity, perhaps understanding that Hannah, like most settlers, had been raised on distorted stories that painted native peoples as primitive savages. They paused near one of the looms where an older woman worked, her fingers moving with practiced precision as she created a complex geometric pattern in red, black, and white wool. Hannah watched, fascinated by the technique. "My mother, Witsoy," Ashki introduced. The woman looked up, studying Hannah with intelligent eyes. Unlike some others in the camp, her gaze held no suspicion, only thoughtful assessment. Hannah inclined, her head respectfully. To her surprise, Witsoy patted the ground beside her loom in invitation. With Ashki's help, Hannah carefully lowered herself to sit, mindful of her injured ribs. Witsoy began to explain her work, speaking in Navajo while demonstrating each step. Though Hannah couldn't understand the words, the visual instruction was clear. After watching for several minutes, Witsoy guided Hannah's hands to the loom, allowing her to attempt a few rows under careful supervision. The shared activity transcended their language barrier. When Hannah successfully completed a section, Witsoy nodded with approval, her weathered face creasing in a smile. The simple acknowledgement of competence, being treated as capable rather than deficient, brought an unexpected lump to Hannah's throat. Ashki watched this exchange with evident satisfaction. "My mother says you have good hands that learn quickly," he translated as they eventually continued their tour. Their next stop was the central fire pit, where several women prepared the day's communal meal. An older woman named Hastian's wife directed the activity with calm efficiency. She offered Hannah a piece of freshly baked blue cornbread, still warm from the cooking stones. As they moved through the camp, Hannah noticed a figure watching them, intently from the doorway of a distant hogan. A young man about Ashki's age, his posture rigid with disapproval. She gestured questioningly toward him. Ashki's expression tightened slightly. "Biyaj, my cousin. He distrusts all who come from Wagon people." The young man maintained his hostile stare until they passed out of view. Hannah pulled out her slate and wrote, "Not everyone welcomes me here. Some remember too well what settlers have done to our people," Ashki acknowledged. "Biyaj's father was killed by soldiers 2 winters ago. His heart remains wounded." Hannah nodded her understanding. She wrote, "Why do you trust me?" Ashki considered her question carefully before answering. "I have traveled more widely than most of my people. I served as guide for a government survey party 4 years ago. I have seen that goodness and cruelty exist in all peoples." He paused. "And Shimasani says your spirit carries no poison." The elderly medicine woman's assessment carried obvious weight with Ashki. Hannah wondered what Shimasani had seen in her that inspired such confidence. They continued to a small clearing where several men crafted arrows, carefully straightening shafts and attaching stone points with sinew and pine pitch. One young man demonstrated his technique for Hannah, showing how he tested each arrow for balance and flight worthiness. By midday, fatigue began to overtake Hannah, the exertion of walking taxing her still healing body. Ashki noticed immediately and guided her toward a shaded area where a fallen log provided natural seating. As they rested, children who had been watching from a distance gradually edged closer, their curiosity overcoming caution. The boldest, a girl of perhaps 7 years, approached directly and touched Hannah's chestnut hair with wondering fingers. Hannah smiled, showing she didn't mind. Encouraged, the child pulled something from a small pouch at her waist, a carved wooden animal that Hannah recognized as a sheep. She offered it to Hannah with solemn dignity. Hannah accepted the gift with equal seriousness, then pulled out her slate. She quickly sketched the little girl's face, capturing her delighted expression in a few deft strokes. The child squealed with pleasure when Hannah showed her the drawing, then ran to show the other children this marvel. Soon, Hannah found herself surrounded by curious youngsters, all requesting their portraits. She obliged as many as she could, her artistic ability, a talent that had found little appreciation in the wagon train, suddenly a source of connection and joy. Ashki watched with evident amusement. "You have made friends faster than anyone expected," he observed as the children finally dispersed, called away by their mothers for the midday meal. Hannah wrote, "Children see with clearer eyes." "Indeed," Ashki agreed. "They have not yet learned to fear what is different." As they prepared to return to Shimasani's hogan, rapid hoofbeats approached from the camp's perimeter. A young Navajo rider galloped in, his horse lathered from hard riding. He called out urgently in Navajo, drawing immediate attention from everyone nearby. Ashki's expression darkened as he listened. He excused himself briefly, conferring with the messenger and several older men who quickly gathered. Hannah couldn't understand their words, but their grave expressions and tense body language conveyed the seriousness of whatever news had arrived. When Ashki returned to her side, his face was grim. "There is trouble," he said quietly. "Army. Patrol approaches from the east. 20 soldiers with a scout who tracks well," Hannah wrote quickly. "Looking for me? Perhaps. Or perhaps responding to reports of the attack on your wagon train." Ashki's tone suggested he suspected the latter. Either way, their presence threatens this camp. She understood immediately. If the soldiers believed the Navajo responsible for attacking settlers, finding a white woman among them, injured no less, would be interpreted in the worst possible way, regardless of the truth. "I should leave," she wrote. "My presence puts your people at risk." Ashki shook his head firmly. "You cannot travel in your condition. And where would you go?" He studied her face. "No, there is another way. But I must ask if you will trust us completely." Hannah didn't hesitate before nodding. The people of this camp had shown her more humanity in a few days than she'd experienced in years with her own kind. Whatever Ashki proposed, she would trust his judgment. "Come," he said, offering his arm. "Once more, we must prepare quickly." He led her not back to Shimasani's hogan, but to his own dwelling at the camp's center. Inside, Nijoni and Witsoe already waited. Various items spread before them: clothing, plant pigments, tools for working leather and bone. "The soldiers must not find a white woman here," Ashki explained, as Nijoni approached with a small clay pot containing some kind of dark liquid. "But they might accept finding a Navajo woman who cannot speak, a wife taken from another clan." Hannah understood the plan immediately. They intended to disguise her as one of their own. The risk Ashki took in suggesting this was enormous. If discovered, he could be charged with kidnapping or worse. Yet he offered this protection without hesitation. "Will it work?" she wrote. "If done well, yes. Your injury provides reason for you to remain mostly secluded in the hogan." Ashki's eyes met hers directly. "But you must decide quickly. The patrol will reach our camp by sunset." Hannah considered for only a moment before writing her answer. "Yes. Show me what to do." What followed was a flurry of activity. Njoni applied a mixture of walnut juice and other plants to Hannah's skin, darkening it to a copper tone similar to their own. Witsoi dressed her in traditional Navajo women's clothing, a dark wool skirt, cotton blouse, and beautifully woven shawl that could be drawn across her face if needed. Most significantly, they rearranged her hair in the traditional style of a married Navajo woman, braided with specific wrappings that indicated her supposed clan affiliation. Small items of silver jewelry, family treasures lent by Witsoi, completed the transformation. When they finished, Njoni held up a polished piece of silver that served as a mirror. Hannah barely recognized herself. The woman who looked back at her could easily be mistaken for Navajo, particularly by soldiers who expected to see native people and who typically paid little attention to individual features. Ashki returned as they completed their work. His eyes widened slightly at the transformation, then he nodded with approval. Good, very good. He turned to his mother and sister. Prepare the camp. Everyone must understand their role. To Hannah, he explained, you will stay here, in my family's Hogan, as my wife from a distant clan, still learning our language after illness took your voice. He hesitated. It means we must share this dwelling, but I will maintain proper distance and respect. Hannah nodded her understanding. The arrangement was unconventional by either cultural standard, but necessity overrode such concerns. She wrote on her slate, I am ready. As Njoni and Witsoi left to help prepare the rest of the camp, Ashki sat across from Hannah, his expression serious. There is risk in this deception. If discovered, consequences would be severe for both of us, but especially for me and my people. Hannah wrote, why take this risk for me? Ashki was silent for a long moment, considering his answer carefully. Because what happens to one innocent person matters. Because your testimony about Fletcher could help my people. And because, he paused, I believe you were sent to us for a purpose, though that purpose may not yet be clear. From outside came the faint sound of a lookout's call. The army patrol had been spotted on the approach to the valley. Their time for preparation had run out. Ashki rose and offered Hannah his hand, helping her to a sitting position on the sleeping pallet where she would be expected to remain during the soldiers' inspection of the camp. Remember, he said quietly, you are Dolly, my wife, still weak from injury and fever. Keep your eyes lowered if any soldier approaches. Most will avoid looking directly at a Navajo woman out of their own discomfort. Hannah squeezed his hand once in acknowledgement, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. The elaborate deception they were about to attempt might protect her and the camp, or it might lead to disaster for everyone involved. Ashki moved to the doorway, then paused to look back at her. Whatever happens, he said with quiet intensity, know that you have found a place among us, Hannah Reed. You are no longer alone. With those words, he stepped outside to meet the approaching soldiers, leaving Hannah to marvel at how completely her world had transformed in less than a week. From unwanted burden to someone worth protecting at great risk, the journey had only just begun, and its path remained uncertain. But for the first time in years, Hannah felt something that had long been foreign to her. Hope. The soldiers arrived. With the clatter of hooves and jingling equipment, their blue uniforms stark against the natural earth tones of the Navajo camp. From her position inside Ashki's Hogan, Hannah could hear male voices, the clipped, authoritative tone of military command mingling with Ashki's measured responses. She adjusted her position on the sleeping pallet, careful to arrange her skirts to cover her splintered ankle. Her heart pounded so violently she feared others might hear it. Everything depended on maintaining the deception, not just her safety, but potentially the well-being of the entire community that had sheltered her. Keeping her eyes downcast as instructed, Hannah focused on her breathing, trying to project the demeanor of a convalescing Navajo woman. The walnut stain on her skin still felt strange, slightly tacky to the touch. She resisted the urge to check if it was wearing off. Voices approached the hogan, one unmistakably Ashkees, the other unfamiliar, deeper with the clipped cadence of military authority. The door covering was pushed aside, allowing afternoon light to flood the dim interior. Hannah kept her gaze fixed on her hands, folded in her lap. "As you can see, Lieutenant, my wife is still recovering," Ashki explained in careful English. The fever damaged her throat. She cannot speak. Hannah felt rather than saw someone enter the hogan behind Ashki. The presence of a stranger, the slight shift in air pressure, the faint smell of horse, tobacco and leather. "Awful convenient that she can't talk, isn't it?" The lieutenant's voice dripped with suspicion. "Especially when we're looking for a missing woman from that wagon train." "My wife fell ill 2 moons ago," Ashki replied evenly. "Long before any wagons were attacked. Shimasani has treated her since then. All in our camp can confirm this." Heavy footsteps approached Hannah's pallet. A pair of dusty cavalry boots appeared at the edge of her vision. "Look at me, woman," the lieutenant commanded. Hannah hesitated, then slowly raised her eyes, careful to maintain a blank expression. The officer was middle-aged, his face weathered by sun and wind, a thick moustache partially concealing his mouth. His eyes, hard, assessing, scanned her face for any sign of deception. "What clan is she from?" he demanded of Ashki. "Tabaunha, from the eastern settlements near the mountains." Ashki's voice remained calm, though Hannah detected an undercurrent of tension. "We married last spring." The lieutenant continued to study Hannah's face. She forced herself to maintain steady eye contact, fighting the impulse to look away. Any sign of fear or discomfort might betray her. "Interesting," the lieutenant finally said, turning back to Ashki. "We received reports that a survivor from the wagon train might have escaped into these hills. A young woman." "We have seen no white woman," Ashki stated firmly. "Only our own people and your soldiers pass through these lands." The lieutenant made a non-committal sound, then addressed Hannah directly. "You understand English, woman?" Hannah gave a small, hesitant nod, playing the role of someone with limited comprehension. "Did you see any white woman near your camp in the past week?" She shook her head slowly, then gestured to her throat and the sleeping palate, indicating she had been too ill to leave the hogan. The lieutenant's gaze narrowed, and for a heart-stopping moment, Hannah thought he saw through their deception. But then his attention shifted back to Ashki. "We'll be making camp near the eastern ridge tonight. My men need rest before we continue our search tomorrow." His tone made it clear this was not a request for permission, but a statement of fact. "I expect your people to keep their distance from our camp." "Of course," Ashki agreed. "We have no wish for trouble." With a final suspicious glance at Hannah, the lieutenant departed. Ashki followed him out, leaving Hannah alone with her thundering pulse and shaking hands. She had passed the first test, but the soldier's extended presence meant sustained vigilance would be necessary. Hannah remained in the hogan as the afternoon stretched into evening, listening to the sounds of the camp, adjusting to the military presence on its outskirts. Nijoni brought her a simple meal and fresh water, slipping in quietly and communicating through gestures. Her expressive face conveyed both concern and encouragement. As darkness fell, Ashki returned, accompanied by Shimasani. The elderly medicine woman examined Hannah's injuries by firelight, applying fresh herbal preparations to her healing wounds. Though they spoke in Navajo, Hannah could tell from their tone that they discussed more than just her physical condition. When Shimasani departed, Ashki settled across the fire pit from Hannah, his face grave in the flickering light. "The soldiers search for you specifically," he confirmed. "Your aunt reported you missing, not dead as I was first told." Hannah's surprise must have shown on her face. She reached for her slate, then hesitated, remembering that even this small item could betray her true identity if seen by the wrong eyes. Ashki understood her dilemma and brought forth a small pouch of fine sand. He spread it on a flat piece of bark, creating a surface where Hannah could trace letters with her finger. "Why would she report me missing?" Hannah wrote. "The army officer who found the wagon train survivors questioned your absence." Ashki explained, "Your aunt first claimed you died in the attack. When pressed further, she admitted she didn't actually see you die, only assumed it when you disappeared during the chaos." Hannah absorbed this information with mixed emotions. Not deliberate abandonment, perhaps, but certainly not concern either. Martha had only corrected her story when challenged. "How long will soldiers stay?" she wrote in the sand. "At least until tomorrow. They search a wide area for signs of survivors or for evidence of who attacked the wagons." Ashki's expression darkened. "Lieutenant Foster seems determined to blame my people, despite what he was told about outlaw raiders." Hannah wrote quickly, "I could tell them truth." "No." Ashki's response was immediate and firm. "If you reveal yourself now, they will claim we abducted you, that we held you against your will. No matter what you say, they will use your presence here as excuse to move against us." She erased her words with a sweep of her hand and wrote again, "Then what can we do?" "We wait. The patrol will leave when they find no evidence. Once your injuries heal more fully, we can find safer way to make your survival known." Ashki studied, her face in the firelight. "Unless you wish to remain as you are now." The suggestion startled Hannah. Remain disguised as a Navajo woman? The idea was both alarming and strangely compelling. She had no family waiting for her, no home to return to. Her aunt and uncle were continuing to California without her. What future awaited a mute woman alone on the frontier? But before she could respond, shouting erupted outside, angry voices in English and Navajo rising in volume. Ashki leapt to his feet and rushed to the door. Hannah struggled to stand, instinctively reaching for her walking stick. "Stay here," Ashki commanded, but Hannah shook her head firmly. Whatever confrontation had erupted, it likely involved her presence, directly or indirectly. She needed to understand what was happening. Leaning heavily on the walking stick, she followed Ashki outside. The camp's central area was illuminated by the main fire, creating a dramatic scene of shadow and light. Lieutenant Foster stood with two of his men, facing Biage and several younger Navajo men. Tension radiated from both groups, hands hovering near weapons. "Your men were caught spying on our camp," Foster accused loudly as Ashki approached. "Explain yourself, Chief." Ashki inserted himself between the opposing groups, his posture straight, his voice controlled. "There has been a misunderstanding. My young men were merely checking our perimeter, as we do every night." With weapons drawn, Foster scoffed. Biage said something in rapid Navajo, his stance aggressive. Ashki responded sharply, clearly, ordering him to stand down. "What did he say?" Foster demanded. "He expressed concern about armed soldiers near our children," Ashki translated diplomatically, though Hannah suspected Biage's actual words had been far less polite. The confrontation had drawn most of the camp residents from their hogans. Hannah remained partially concealed in the shadows near Ashki's dwelling, observing the scene. She noticed Nijoni moving among the children, quietly gathering them away from potential danger. "Your young men have been hostile since our arrival," Foster continued. "Makes me wonder what you're hiding." "We hide nothing," Ashki replied steadily. "We simply wish to be left in peace." Foster's gaze swept the assembled Navajo. "I find that hard to believe when raiders matching your people's description have attacked 3 wagon trains in as many months." "Not our people," Ashki stated firmly. "As I have explained, outlaws disguise themselves to blame us." "Convenient explanation," Foster sneered. He turned to one of his soldiers. "Corporal, assemble the men." I want this entire camp searched, now. The decree sent a ripple of alarm through the gathered Navajo. Ashki stepped forward, his voice taking on a new edge of authority. You have no right. We have cooperated with your questions. We have allowed your presence near our home. You dishonor the peace between your government and our people with these actions. Foster was unmoved. I have every right, when investigating attacks on American citizens, stand aside or be arrested for interfering. With a military investigation, the situation balanced on a knife's edge. Biage and the younger men looked ready to fight, despite being outnumbered and outgunned by the soldiers now gathering at the camp's edge. The women moved closer to their children, faces tight with fear and anger. Hannah knew she had to act. If the soldiers searched the camp thoroughly, they would eventually discover evidence of her true identity, her original clothing perhaps, or the slate and chalk. Even the walnut stain on her skin might not withstand close scrutiny under better light. More importantly, she couldn't allow violence to erupt because of her. Couldn't bear the thought of people who had shown her kindness being harmed for protecting her. Decision made, Hannah stepped forward into the firelight, moving slowly but deliberately with her walking stick. All eyes turned to her as she approached the confrontation. Dolly, go back, Ashki urged in English, his eyes communicating both understanding and warning. This is not safe. Hannah ignored him, continuing forward until she stood directly between Ashki and Lieutenant Foster, drawing herself up as straight. As her injuries allowed, she met Foster's suspicious gaze without flinching. Then, with deliberate movements, she reached up and loosened her hair from its traditional Navajo styling, letting it fall around her shoulders in its natural chestnut waves. She rubbed the back of her hand against her cheek, smearing the walnut stain to reveal patches of her true complexion beneath. A collective gasp rose from both the Navajo and the soldiers. Foster's eyes widened in shock, then narrowed in vindication. Just as I suspected, he said grimly. These savages have been holding you captive. He turned to his men. Secure the woman and arrest the chief. The rest of you, take these people into custody. As soldiers moved to obey, Hannah shook her head vehemently, stepping protectively in front of Ashki. She pointed to herself, then to the Navajo, and made a series of urgent gestures trying to communicate that she was there willingly. She's clearly been intimidated, Foster declared, misinterpreting her actions. Probably fears for her life if she indicates otherwise. A soldier grasped Hannah's arm to pull her away. She resisted, looking desperately around for some way to communicate the truth. Nijoni suddenly pushed forward through the crowd, her hands clutching something, Hannah's slate and chalk. Ignoring the soldier's warnings, Nijoni pressed these into Hannah's hands. Hannah immediately began to write, her hands shaking with urgency. When she finished, she held the slate up for Foster to read. I am Hannah Reed. I was injured in the wagon train attack. These people saved me. They have shown only kindness. Foster read the message, his certainty visibly faltering. You weren't taken against your will. Hannah wrote quickly, thrown from wagon during attack, left for dead. Ashki found me, brought me here for healing. Disguise was to protect me when you arrived. The lieutenant's jaw tightened as he processed this information. The disguise suggests guilt, not protection. They feared you would blame them for attack, Hannah wrote. Attack was led by Wilson Fletcher, former scout from our train. He and his men disguised as Indians. This revelation caused Foster to exchange glances with his corporal. Fletcher. We've had reports about him operating in this territory. Hannah nodded emphatically, adding to her message, I saw him clearly, can identify him. These people are innocent. A tense silence fell over the gathering as Foster considered her words. The accusation of white outlaws disguising themselves as natives to commit atrocities wasn't new. Such tactics had been documented before. But military men like Foster were often reluctant to acknowledge such complexities when simpler narratives served their purposes better. Finally, Foster turned to Ashki. If what she writes is true, why the elaborate deception? Why not simply tell us you had found a survivor? Before Ashki could answer, Hannah wrote again, because settlers and soldiers have given them no reason to trust. Would you have believed him? Her direct challenge hung in the air. Uncomfortable but undeniable, Foster's expression suggested he understood the truth in her assessment, even if he didn't like it. Lower your weapons, he finally ordered his men. It seems there's more to this situation than I initially believed. Dawn arrived with uneasy quiet settling over the Navajo camp. The confrontation had ended without bloodshed, but Lieutenant Foster had established a perimeter of guards around the settlement, ostensibly for mutual protection, but effectively placing everyone under surveillance until he decided his next course of action. Hannah sat with Ashki and other tribal leaders inside the largest Wagon, where a tense council session had continued through most of the night. Now that her true identity had been revealed, she no longer needed to maintain the deception of being Ashki's wife, though she still wore the Navajo clothing, having nothing else suitable to wear. Foster sat opposite them, flanked by his corporal and sergeant. The military men looked tired but alert, their initial hostility tempered somewhat by Hannah's written testimony, yet skepticism remained evident in their posture. Let me ensure I understand the situation correctly, Foster said, reviewing the notes he'd been taking. You claim that Wilson Fletcher, formerly employed by the Hartman wagon train, deliberately attacked your group disguised as Navajo to conceal his identity and misdirect blame. Hannah nodded, writing on her slate, he was dismissed for stealing, swore revenge, returned with armed men. Some wore paint and feathers as disguise. And during this attack, you were thrown from a wagon and somehow ended up in a ravine where Chief Ashki here conveniently found you? Foster's tone indicated his lingering doubts. Oxen panicked. Wagon went over edge of trail. I was thrown clear. Ashki found me injured, brought me here for healing. Hannah's chalk moved rapidly across the slate, her frustration with Foster's. Skepticism evident in her forceful strokes. The coincidence seems remarkable, Foster observed dryly. Ashki spoke then, his voice measured despite the insult implicit in Foster's tone. I was tracking the attackers, following their trail east when I found Hannah in the ravine. Not coincidence. I was there because of the attack. Foster turned his attention to Ashki. And why were you tracking these raiders if, as you claim, you knew nothing about the attack beforehand? We have lost hunters to similar attacks, Ashki explained patiently, though Hannah could sense his growing irritation at having to repeatedly justify himself. 3 men from our camp killed 2 moons ago. Army blamed rogue Comanche, but we found white man's tobacco pouch near bodies. This information seemed to give Foster pause. He exchanged glances with his sergeant before continuing. You never reported this to the authorities at Fort Defiance. We reported, Ashki corrected. Army commander said evidence insufficient, suggested our hunters violated treaty boundaries, deserved their fate. The bitter truth in Ashki's statement hung in the air. Hannah had learned enough during her time with the Navajo to understand the reality. Reports from native people were routinely dismissed, their evidence discounted, their grievances ignored by territorial authorities more interested in expanding settlement than in justice. Foster shifted uncomfortably, but didn't dispute Ashki's account. What were you doing alone in contested territory, Chief? Most Navajo travel in groups these days. I move more quickly alone. Less noticeable. Ashki met Foster's gaze directly. I am scout. I read signs others miss. When I found wagon attack site, I followed Raider's trail until discovering Hannah. Hannah wrote, he saved my life. I would have died from exposure and injuries. Foster read her words, his expression softening slightly. I'm not disputing that he may have helped you, Miss Reed. The question is what happens now. Hannah hadn't considered this question fully, too preoccupied with immediate survival, and then with protecting the community that had sheltered her. Now the future loomed as an uncertain shadow. What options exist, she wrote. The standard procedure would be to escort you to Fort Defiance, Foster explained. From there, arrangements could be made to reunite you with your family or transport you to the settlement in California they were heading toward. Hannah's hand tightened around the chalk. The prospect of being returned to the aunt and uncle who had so readily abandoned her held no appeal. I have no wish to rejoin my aunt and uncle, she wrote firmly. They left believing me dead, did not search for me. Foster frowned. Nevertheless, they are your legal guardians. You cannot simply remain with... He gestured vaguely at the Navajo leaders. These people. His dismissive tone sparked anger in Hannah. She wrote quickly, holding up the slate for all to see. These people showed me more humanity in 1 week than my family did in years. I am of legal age, 22 years. I make my own decisions now. The lieutenant appeared taken aback, both by the force of her statement and the revelation of her age. He had clearly assumed she was younger, perhaps still legally a minor, requiring guardianship. I see, he said finally. That changes the legal considerations. A new voice entered the conversation. Shimasani, who had remained quiet until now, observing from the shadows. She spoke in Navajo, her words carrying the weight of elder wisdom. Ashki translated for Hannah and the soldiers. The medicine. Woman says Hannah's path crossed ours for a purpose. The soldier's arrival is part of this purpose. All pieces move together in the pattern the Creator weaves. Foster looked uncomfortable with this spiritual perspective, but something in Shimasani's dignified presence commanded respect, even from the skeptical officer. What purpose could that possibly be? He asked, more curious than dismissive. Ashki translated Shimasani's response: to bring truth where lies have flourished, to create understanding between peoples who see each other as enemies, to show that compassion exists in unexpected places. The poetic answer seemed to affect Foster, despite himself. He glanced at Hannah, then back to Ashki. There is another consideration, he admitted reluctantly. Miss Reed's testimony about Fletcher could be valuable. We've suspected for months that he and his gang were behind attacks blamed on various tribes, but lacked first-hand witnesses willing to testify. Hannah hadn't considered this angle. Her status as a survivor who could identify Fletcher made her potentially important to the authorities, beyond just being a lost settler. I will testify to what I saw, she wrote, but I need time to heal first. Foster nodded slowly. Your injuries do preclude immediate travel. He seemed to be thinking aloud, working through possible solutions. I could leave a small detachment here to ensure your safety until you're fit. For the journey to Fort Defiance, Ashki exchanged glances with the other Navajo leaders. Having soldiers stationed permanently in their camp would bring its own complications and tensions. Hannah wrote, No need, I'm safe here. Your men would only create unnecessary friction. My duty is to ensure the safety and well-being of American citizens, Foster countered. I cannot simply leave you in a Navajo camp with no protection or oversight. I am not unsafe, Hannah wrote emphatically, and I am not a child needing supervision. The standoff might have continued, but Ashki offered an alternative. I will personally guarantee Miss Reed's safety and escort her to Fort Defiance when her injuries heal sufficiently for travel. You have my word as chief. Foster considered this compromise. And how would I know you've kept this promise? I will, send messenger to fort in 1 moon cycle with report on her condition, Ashkai proposed. When she is ready to travel, I will bring her myself. Hannah watched this negotiation with mixed emotions. While appreciative of Ashki's efforts to find a solution that respected her wishes, the prospect of eventually being handed over to military authorities at Fort Defiance, and from there, potentially forced to rejoin her aunt and uncle's journey, filled her with dread. She wrote quickly, "Lieutenant Foster, I have information about Fletcher's gang that could help prevent further attacks. I offer a trade, my testimony in exchange for allowing me to determine my own future afterward." Foster read her proposal with raised eyebrows. "That's not how the law works, Miss Reed. Your testimony would be your civic duty, not a bargaining chip." "Then consider this. Who will tell my story more convincingly to a territorial judge? A woman who feels she has been respected and given choices, or one who has been forced against her will?" The shrewd argument caught Foster off guard. He studied Hannah with new appreciation for her intelligence and determination. "You've become rather unconventional in your thinking during your time here," he observed. Hannah's response was immediate. "Perhaps I've simply found my voice in silence." Her words hung in the air, unexpectedly profound. After a moment's consideration, Foster nodded slowly. "Very well. I'll accept Chief Ashki's proposal with one modification. I'll return in exactly 4 weeks with a small detachment to check on your progress. If you're well enough to travel then, you'll accompany us to Fort Defiance to provide your testimony. Afterward," he hesitated, clearly stepping beyond his usual protocols, "your future arrangements can be discussed based on your preferences." It wasn't everything Hannah had hoped for, but it represented a significant concession from a military man accustomed to issuing orders rather than negotiating compromises. "Agreed," she wrote simply. With the immediate issue resolved, Foster and his men prepared to depart. The camp remained tense, with the Navajo, particularly Biage and his friends, watching the soldiers' every move with suspicion. As Foster mounted his horse, he turned to Ashki with a final warning. "Remember, Chief, I'm extending considerable trust here. Don't make me regret it." "We keep our promises," Ashki replied with quiet dignity. "Do your people do the same?" The pointed question remained unanswered as Foster signaled his men to move out. The patrol departed with much less hostility than they had arrived, but Hannah knew this tentative peace remained fragile. Once the soldiers were safely beyond the valley's edge, the camp exhaled collectively. Children emerged from hogans, where they had been kept during the negotiations. Women resumed their daily activities with relieved expressions. "You negotiated well," Ashki told Hannah as they watched the dust cloud of the departing patrol fade in the distance. "Foster is not a bad man, simply one bound by rules he rarely questions." Hannah nodded, understanding the distinction. Foster represented the unyielding machinery of westward expansion, not deliberately malicious, but dangerous nonetheless, in its assumption that one way of life must inevitably yield to another. "What happens now?" she wrote. "Now you continue healing," Ashki replied, "and we prepare for what comes next." Hannah hesitated, then wrote, "I revealed your deception, put everyone at risk. I'm sorry." Ashki considered her words, then shook his head. "You prevented a violence by showing yourself. It was brave decision, not wrong one." This absolution eased the guilt that had been gnawing at Hannah since the confrontation. She had acted on instinct, choosing what seemed the only path to prevent bloodshed, but had worried about the consequences for the community. "Foster will return," she wrote. "What then?" "Then we face what comes," Ashki answered simply, "but that is future concern. Today we focus on your recovery." As they walked slowly back toward the center of camp, Hannah contemplated the strange twist her life had taken. A month ago, she'd been a silent, overlooked burden, dragged reluctantly toward California by relatives who barely acknowledged her existence. Now she found herself a pivotal figure in a complex drama involving military authorities, outlaws, and a Navajo community that had embraced her more fully than her own family ever had. Most surprisingly, she, who had never been allowed to make meaningful choices about her own life, now found herself negotiating her future on her own terms. The irony wasn't lost on her. In losing everything, she had somehow found a kind of freedom. Nijoni approached as they reached Ashki's hogan, her expression a mixture of relief and curiosity. She made a series of gestures, asking if Hannah was all right. Hannah nodded, smiling slightly despite her exhaustion. She reached for her slate, but found the chalk had worn down to a nub too small to use effectively. Nijoni noticed her dilemma and produced something from her pocket, a small stick of charcoal, better for writing than the crumbling chalk. The simple gesture of thoughtfulness, noticing a need and addressing it without being asked, epitomized what Hannah had experienced repeatedly among the Navajo. "Thank you," she wrote with the charcoal, the words inadequate for the depth of gratitude she felt, not just for the writing implement, but for everything the community had done for her. Nijoni's smile suggested she understood what remained unwritten. She gestured toward Hannah's splintered ankle with a questioning expression. "Shimasani wishes to check her injuries," Ashki explained. "The walking during confrontation may have caused damage." Hannah nodded her agreement, realizing for the first time how much pain had returned to her ankle and ribs in the aftermath of the tension. The emotional stress of the confrontation had temporarily masked her physical discomfort, but now it reasserted itself with throbbing insistence. As Nijoni helped her settle onto the sleeping pallet in Ashki's hogan, which would remain her quarters, despite the abandoned pretense of being his wife, Hannah contemplated the 4-week reprieve they had negotiated. In that time, her body would continue healing, but what of her future? Foster would return, expecting to escort her to Fort Defiance. What options would truly be available to her then? The question lingered, unanswered but persistent, as Shimasani arrived to tend her injuries. A mute woman caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither, yet somehow finding her strongest voice in the space between. The days following Lieutenant Foster's departure brought a new rhythm to the Navajo camp. With Hannah's true identity now known to all, the community adjusted to her presence in different ways. Many, like Nijoni and Shimasani, treated her no differently than before. Their acceptance had never been contingent on deception. Others, particularly Biage and his friends, maintained a cool distance, their trust damaged by what they perceived as a dangerous entanglement with the white world. Ashki navigated these tensions with diplomatic skill, neither forcing acceptance nor tolerating outright hostility. He made it clear that Hannah remained under his protection, but also emphasized to her the legitimate concerns some had about her presence and the military interest she had drawn to their previously hidden camp. 2 weeks after Foster's departure, Hannah sat outside Witsoi's hogan, observing as the older woman demonstrated the complex art of Navajo weaving. Her own ankle had healed enough that she could walk short distances without the walking stick, though Shimasani insisted she continue using it for longer journeys around the camp. "Your hands remember quickly," Witsoi commented in her limited English as Hannah successfully completed a small section of the pattern. The older woman had been teaching her basic weaving techniques, seemingly pleased with her students' progress. Hannah smiled at the praise. She had discovered an unexpected talent for the intricate work, her fingers nimble and precise despite her lack of experience. Working alongside Witsoi provided a peaceful respite from the underlying anxiety about Foster's eventual return. Using the small notebook and pencil Ashki had procured for her from a trading post, more practical for daily communication than the slate, Hannah wrote, "Your designs tell stories. I would like to learn what they mean." Witsoi nodded, her weathered fingers tracing a diamond pattern in the partially completed blanket between them. With patience and occasional help from Nijoni to translate more complex concepts, she began, explaining how each geometric form represented elements of the natural world and Navajo spiritual beliefs. As Hannah absorbed this knowledge, she noticed a group of riders approaching from the eastern pass. Not soldiers in blue uniforms, but Navajo men returning from what appeared to be a hunting expedition. Ashki rode at their head, his expression grave as he dismounted and spoke urgently with the camp sentries. Hannah watched as word spread quickly through the camp, creating a ripple of tension. Women called children closer to the hogans. Men moved toward the central gathering area where Ashki now stood. Witsoi set aside her weaving. "Come," she said simply, helping Hannah to her feet. By the time they reached the gathering, Ashki was addressing the assembled community in Navajo. Hannah couldn't understand his words, but the reactions they provoked, grim nods, angry mutters, fearful glances, told her the news was troubling. Nijoni appeared at her side, her expression worried. "Fletcher's men," she explained in halting English, using signs to supplement words Hannah had taught her, attacked trading post 2 days south. Hannah's stomach clenched. Wilson Fletcher, the man responsible for the wagon train massacre, was active in the region. She made her way through the crowd toward Ashki, who acknowledged her with a nod as he continued speaking to the community. When the meeting concluded and people dispersed to prepare defenses, Hannah approached Ashki directly, holding up her notebook with a simple question. "What happened?" "Fletcher and his men raided Andrew's trading post 2 days' ride south of here," Ashki explained, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Killed the trader and his Ute wife, took supplies, ammunition, furs." Hannah wrote quickly. "Did they disguise themselves as Navajo again?" "Yes. Left arrows and moccasin prints to suggest Navajo raiders." Ashki's jaw clenched. Already rumors spread. Settlers near Silver Creek talk of organizing militia for revenge against our people. The implications were clear. Fletcher's gang was continuing their pattern of violence while deliberately stoking conflict between settlers and native peoples. More deaths would follow, with innocent Navajo likely paying the price for crimes they hadn't committed. "We must tell Foster," Hannah wrote, "my testimony plus this new attack." "Foster returns in 2 weeks," Ashki reminded her. "By then, militia may already strike our people, and Fletcher's band will have moved on, leaving only false evidence behind." The helplessness of their position struck Hannah forcefully. Even with her eyewitness account and Ashki's tracking skills, they faced the fundamental problem that had always plagued relations between natives and settlers. White authorities simply gave more weight to accusations against indigenous people than to their defenses. "What will you do?" she asked. Ashki glanced toward where the council elders had gathered near his mother's hogan. "We discuss moving camp, higher into mountains, away from likely militia paths. The prospect of the community being forced to abandon their summer grounds, their gardens still heavy with ripening crops, their carefully established shelters and storage areas, because of Fletcher's deliberate provocations, struck Hannah as profoundly unjust. "There must be another way," she wrote, frustration evident in her forceful strokes. Ashki studied her face. "What do you suggest?" The direct question caught Hannah off guard. No one in her previous life had ever asked for her opinion on matters of consequence. She considered carefully before writing, "We go to Fort Defiance now. Don't wait for Foster. I testify about what I saw. You report new attack." Together, our words might be heard. Ashki's expression revealed both appreciation for her suggestion and doubt about its efficacy. "Fort commander might arrest me on sight. Might claim I kidnapped you, despite your words." "Then I go first," Hannah proposed. "Alone. My ankle is strong enough for riding if we take it slowly." "Too dangerous," Ashki responded immediately. "Fletcher's men patrol roads, An army may not believe woman alone, especially one who cannot speak. Hannah's frustration mounted. She was offering a solution that might prevent bloodshed, yet found herself constrained once again by assumptions about her limitations. Not from Ashki this time, but from the very structures of the society she had come from. As they debated, Biage approached, having evidently overheard their conversation. He spoke rapidly in Navajo to Ashki, his gestures animated and insistent. "My cousin suggests different approach," Ashki translated, a new consideration entering his expression, one that uses Fletcher's tactics against him. Hannah tilted her head questioningly. "Fletcher succeeds because he creates false evidence that fits what authorities already believe," Ashki explained. "Biage suggests we create our own evidence. But truth, not lies." "What kind of evidence?" Hannah wrote. "Proof that Fletcher's band attacks both settlers and Navajo. Proof that cannot be dismissed." Ashki's eyes took on a determined gleam. "We track Fletcher's men from trading post, not to attack, only to observe, to document." The plan held obvious risks, but Hannah immediately grasped its potential. If they could gather indisputable evidence of Fletcher's deceptions, it might force authorities to act, regardless of their prejudices. "How would you document what you see?" she asked. Biage spoke again, this time pulling something from his pouch, a small brass spyglass, likely obtained through trade, or perhaps taken from a soldier during some past conflict. "We watch, we record movements, numbers, weapons," Ashki translated. "And this." He reached into his own pouch and produced a folded piece of paper, a rough but serviceable map of the territory. "We mark their camps, their paths, create record. Army cannot ignore." Hannah nodded her understanding of the strategy, but another question occurred to her. Why is Biage suggesting this now? He has never trusted me before. Ashki relayed the question. Biage responded directly to Hannah, his English broken but understandable. "Not trust you still," he stated bluntly. "But Fletcher kills my people. You see truth. Maybe white soldiers listen to white women when they never listen to us." The pragmatic alliance Biage offered wasn't based on personal warmth or acceptance, but on shared opposition to a common enemy. Hannah could respect that kind of honesty more than false friendship. She wrote, "I want to help. What can I do?" Ashki and Biage exchanged glances. "You stay here," Ashki said firmly. "Too dangerous for you to track Fletcher, and your presence would slow us." Hannah's immediate impulse was to protest, to insist on accompanying them despite her limitations, but she recognized the practical truth in Ashki's assessment. Her still healing injuries and lack of wilderness skills would indeed be a liability in such a mission. Instead, she wrote, "While you track Fletcher, I can prepare documentation for the army, written testimony, detailed account of Wagon train, attack and what I've witnessed since." The suggestion earned an approving nod from Ashki. "Good. Stronger case with both our evidence combined." "When do we go?" Biage asked, his eagerness evident despite his continued wariness around Hannah. "Tomorrow at dawn," Ashki decided. "Small group, 5 riders only, less visible that way." As the men moved off to select their companions and prepare for the tracking expedition, Hannah remained in the central area, her thoughts churning. The plan had merit, but also significant dangers. Fletcher's gang was well armed and ruthless. If Ashki and his small group were discovered while gathering evidence, they would face overwhelming odds. Moreover, she worried about leaving the more vulnerable members of the community with fewer protectors. If the rumored settler militia decided to attack while Ashki and the other skilled warriors were away, those remaining would be at greater risk. Nijoni approached, having observed the conversation from a distance. She gestured questioningly toward the departing men. Hannah wrote briefly in her notebook, explaining the plan to track Fletcher's gang and gather evidence. Nijoni's expression shifted from curiosity to concern as she read. "Dangerous," she signed, Having learned this and other basic hand signals from Hannah over the past weeks, their improvised communication system combined elements of writing, gesture, and the few English words Nijoni knew. Yes, Hannah agreed, but necessary. Nijoni considered this, then signed, "You worry for brother." Hannah couldn't deny it. Over the weeks of recovery, her feelings toward Ashki had evolved from gratitude to respect, and then to something more complex that she hesitated to name even to herself. His quiet strength, unwavering integrity, and the gentle authority with which he led his people had affected her deeply. "I worry for everyone," she wrote instead. Nijoni's knowing look suggested she understood what Hannah left unwritten. She patted Hannah's hand reassuringly, then gestured toward Shimasani's hogan. "Come, help prepare medicines for journey." The activity would provide welcome distraction, Hannah decided, following Nijoni across the camp. As they walked, she noticed the changed atmosphere, women packing essential items, men checking weapons, families drawing closer together in preparation for potential disruption. Inside Shimasani's hogan, the elderly medicine woman already worked methodically, preparing small pouches of healing herbs and protective medicines for the tracking party. She nodded approvingly as Hannah and Nijoni joined her efforts. As they worked, Hannah considered the 4 weeks that had passed since her arrival in the camp. What had begun as desperate survival had transformed into something altogether different. Nay, a sense of purpose and belonging she had never experienced before. These people, initially strangers from a culture entirely foreign to her own, had become more like family than the blood relatives who had abandoned her. Yet the precarious nature of their situation had never been more evident. Fletcher's continuing violence threatened not just individual lives, but the fragile balance that allowed the Navajo to maintain their way of life in a territory increasingly dominated by white expansion. Hannah reached for a new page in her notebook and began drafting her testimony for the Army authorities, determined to make it so compelling and detailed that even the most prejudiced officer would have to acknowledge its truth. It might be the only real contribution she could make to protect the community that had saved her, but she would ensure it was powerful enough to matter. Outside, the sun began its descent toward the western mesas, casting long shadows across the camp. Tomorrow, Ashki and his small band would depart on their dangerous mission to gather evidence against Fletcher. Hannah could only hope that their combined efforts would be enough to bring justice before more innocent lives were lost on either side of the cultural divide that she now straddled, no longer fully belonging to the world of her birth, yet not fully integrated into the Navajo way of life either. In this liminal space, she had found her voice in unexpected ways. Now she would use it to speak truth to power, even if that truth had to be written rather than spoken aloud. Dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of amber and rose as Ashki and his 4 chosen companions prepared for departure. They traveled light, each man carrying only essential supplies, weapons, and the documentation tools that formed the core of their mission. No extra blankets, minimal food, nothing that would slow their pursuit of Fletcher's gang. Hannah stood with the small group of women who had gathered to see the men off. Shimasani moved among the riders, pressing small medicine pouches into their hands with murmured blessings. Witsoy adjusted her son's saddle with the practiced movements of a woman who had sent men to hunt and to war countless times before. When Ashki approached Hannah, his expression was solemn but determined. "We will return in 5 days," he said, quietly. "If we do not—" He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. Hannah nodded her understanding, then held out a folded piece of paper. She had worked late into the night, using her growing vocabulary of Navajo words mixed with English to create a simple but effective lexicon, a reference guide Ashki could use to translate key terms when they eventually presented their evidence to military authorities. Ashki accepted the paper, tucking it carefully into his leather pouch. "Clever," he acknowledged with the hint of a smile. "Always finding ways to bridge worlds." She handed him a second item, a small, leather-bound notebook with several pages of her careful handwriting, her detailed account of the wagon train attack and everything she had witnessed since, including precise descriptions of Fletcher and his key men. Whether Ashki returned with additional evidence or not, this testimony would form the foundation of their case. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, the brief contact sending an unexpected warmth through Hannah's hand. For a moment, their eyes held, communicating something neither had put into words. Jaz's impatient call broke the moment. With a final nod to Hannah, Ashki mounted his painted horse and led his small band out of the camp, following the hidden trails that would take them south toward the raided trading post, where they would pick up Fletcher's trail. The camp seemed oddly empty after their departure. Though only 5 men had left, their absence created a palpable void, particularly Ashki's. Without his quiet authority, subtle tensions that he normally managed began to surface more openly. By midday, Hannah noticed Biaaj's 2 younger brothers arguing with an elder about guard rotations. Without Ashki's diplomatic presence, disagreements about how to protect the camp threatened to divide rather than unite the community in this time of heightened alert. Hannah observed from the sidelines, understanding enough of the dynamics now to recognize the problems but unable to intervene directly. Her status as an outsider made any attempt to mediate unwelcome, despite her growing acceptance among many of the Navajo. It was Nijoni who ultimately restored order, stepping between the arguing men with an authority that surprised Hannah. Though hampered by her partial deafness, Ashki's sister possessed her own kind of quiet strength. With firm gestures and carefully chosen words, she reminded the men of their shared purpose, protecting the camp, and proposed a compromise that satisfied both sides. As the dispute settled, Nijoni caught Hannah watching and made her way over, looking tired but satisfied. "That was impressive," Hannah wrote in her notebook. Nijoni shrugged modestly, then signed, "Brother teaches by example." The simple statement revealed much about how leadership functioned within the community, not through domination or rigid hierarchy, but through modeling behavior that others could emulate when necessary. "Will they listen to you if trouble comes?" Hannah asked, concerned about the community's safety during Ashki's absence. "Some yes, some no," Nijoni signed pragmatically, "but all listened to Shimasani." Hannah nodded, understanding. The elderly medicine woman carried tremendous respect within the camp. If crisis came, her influence would likely prove decisive. In maintaining unity, the day passed in tense vigilance, with sentries posted on the ridges surrounding the valley. Hannah kept herself busy, helping prepare food, working on her weaving with Witsoi, and continuing her improvised language lessons with the children, who delighted in teaching her Navajo words and learning English ones in return. By evening, everyone gathered around the central fire, the communal meal, serving as both practical sustenance and symbolic reassurance of their solidarity. Shimasani led prayers for the safety of the tracking party, her weathered hands moving in precise gestures that needed no translation, universal pleas for protection and safe return. As darkness deepened, Hannah returned to Ashki's hogan, which she still occupied despite his absence. She settled onto her sleeping pallet, trying to ignore the worry that had taken root in her chest. Fletcher's gang outnumbered Ashki's small group. If discovered while tracking, the Navajo men would face deadly odds. Sleep proved elusive, her mind filled with possibilities both hopeful and dire. When she finally drifted off near midnight, her dreams were fragmented and anxious. Images of Fletcher's leering face, of Ashkey wounded and alone in unfamiliar terrain, of soldiers surrounding the Navajo camp with weapons drawn. She woke before dawn to the sound of hurried movement outside. Grabbing her shawl, Hannah emerged to find the camp in controlled chaos. Women packed essential items, while men gathered weapons, their expressions grim. Nijoni appeared at her side, signing urgently, "Militia coming." Hannah's heart sank. The very scenario they had feared was unfolding. Settler vigilantes seeking revenge for Fletcher's attack on the trading post, believing the Navajo responsible. How many? How far? She wrote quickly. 15 riders, from south, 2 hours away, Nijoni signed, her hands trembling slightly despite her outward calm. Hannah did rapid calculations. With Ashkey and his companions absent, the camp had fewer than 10 men of fighting age remaining. They were significantly outnumbered, and escape options were limited with children, elders, and their essential possessions to transport. "What is the plan?" she asked. "Move to cave shelter. High cliffs. Defensible." Nijoni gestured toward the northern peaks, where Hannah knew ancient cliff dwellings provided natural protection. It was the logical solution, retreat to a position that negated the militia's numerical advantage. But Hannah immediately recognized a problem with this strategy. "They will follow. Find tracks," she wrote. Nijoni nodded grimly. "Know this. No choice." Hannah stared at the bustling camp, an idea forming. There was another option. Risky, perhaps. Foolhardy, but potentially effective. She had spent weeks disguised as a Navajo woman. Perhaps it was time to leverage her true identity in the opposite direction. She quickly outlined her proposal to Nijoni, whose eyes widened as she read Hannah's rapidly scribbled plan. "Too dangerous," Nijoni signed emphatically. "Less dangerous." "Than fighting," Hannah countered. "I can delay them, give you time to reach caves without leaving clear trail." Nijoni studied her face, clearly torn between concern for Hannah's safety and recognition of the plan's potential merit. Finally, she nodded reluctantly and went to consult Shimasani and the remaining elders. What followed was a flurry of activity as Hannah prepared for her dangerous gambit. Her Navajo clothing was exchanged for her original dress, now cleaned and mended by Witsoy's skilled hands. Her hair was arranged in the simple style she had worn among the settlers. Most importantly, she washed away all traces of the walnut stain from her skin, reclaiming her identity as Hannah Reed, survivor of the wagon train attack. Shimasani approached as these preparations concluded, pressing a small medicine pouch into Hannah's hand. Unlike the ones given to the tracking party, this one was decorated with a specific pattern that Hannah recognized from her weaving lessons, the symbol for protection and safe return. The elderly medicine woman held Hannah's gaze for a long moment, then pressed her weathered palm against the younger woman's cheek in a gesture of blessing and farewell. "I will be careful," Hannah wrote, "and I will return." Whether this promise could be kept remained uncertain, but the intention behind it was genuine. In the short span of her time among the Navajo, Hannah had found something she had never truly experienced before, a sense of belonging, of value, of purpose. She would not abandon that lightly. With final preparations complete, Hannah mounted a dun-colored mare, not one of the Navajo's prized riding horses, but a steady animal that would serve her purpose. A young man would accompany her partway, then circle back to rejoin the retreating camp, creating misleading tracks to confuse any pursuers. As Hannah rode out of the valley along the southern trail, she looked back once at the community preparing for evacuation. Women loaded essentials onto travois, children gathered in silent groups, elders directed the careful obliteration of signs showing which direction they would flee. The responsibility she had taken upon herself settled heavily. on her shoulders. If her plan failed, the consequences would be dire, not just for her, but for everyone who had sheltered and healed her. Yet beneath the weight of that responsibility lay a kind of fierce determination that would have been unimaginable to the meek, silent woman who had traveled with the Hartman wagon train just weeks ago. She rode directly toward the approaching militia, a solitary figure on the vast landscape, her mind focused on the role she must play perfectly if her desperate gambit was to succeed. No longer pretending to be Navajo, she would now leverage her identity as a white woman. But this time, the deception would serve to protect rather than endanger those who had rescued her. Behind her, the Navajo camp was already disappearing, expertly dismantled by people who had generations of experience in leaving no trace when necessary. By the time she intercepted the militia, there would be little evidence of permanent habitation in the valley, and what remained would offer no clear indication of where its residents had fled. Hannah straightened her back, ignoring the lingering ache in her ribs, and urged her horse forward. The plateau ahead would provide her first glimpse of the approaching riders and their first sight of her. Everything depended on that initial encounter, and the story she would tell through written words and careful gestures. For a woman who had been silenced all her life, it was strangely fitting that her greatest act of courage would rely on crafting a narrative without speaking a single word. 3 months later, Hannah stood on the wooden porch of Fort Defiance's administrative building, watching as Lieutenant Foster read through the official documents that would forever change her life. The autumn wind carried the scent of pine from the distant mountains, a reminder of the Navajo homeland where her journey had begun. "These appear to be in order, Miss Reed," Foster said finally, looking up from the papers. His expression held a mixture of respect and lingering disbelief. "Though I must say, when you first arrived here under such unusual circumstances, I never imagined this outcome." Hannah smiled slightly, accepting the documents as he handed them back. The territorial governor's seal made them official. Her appointment as licensed interpreter and cultural liaison between the Navajo Nation and the territorial government. The first woman to hold such a position, and certainly the first who communicated primarily through writing rather than speech. She wrote in her notebook, "Thank you for your support, Lieutenant. Your testimony regarding Fletcher's gang made this possible." Foster nodded, his former suspicion of the Navajo tempered by the events of the past months. 20 years in uniform, and I've never seen evidence as thorough as what Chief Ashkey provided. Combined with your written account and the recovered items from Fletcher's camp," he shook his head in admiration, "irrefutable proof of their deception." Hannah's mind flashed back to that pivotal day when multiple strands of their story had converged in unexpected ways. Her desperate gambit with the militia had succeeded, partially through luck, partially through her quick thinking. She had intercepted the riders, presenting herself as a survivor of Fletcher's attack on the trading post who had escaped into the wilderness. The militia leader, a grizzled rancher named Thornton, had been skeptical until Hannah showed him the distinctive bullet scar on her forearm, legacy of her fall from the wagon. She had written a convincing account of seeing Fletcher's men don native disguises after the raid and claimed to be searching for military authorities to report what she'd witnessed. Her performance had bought precious time, diverting the militia from their planned attack on the now empty Navajo camp. Thornton had insisted on escorting her to Fort Defiance himself, unwittingly taking his men in exactly the opposite direction from where the Navajo had fled. By extraordinary coincidence, they had arrived at the fort on the same day as Ashkey's party returned from their tracking mission, and just hours after Lieutenant Foster had captured 2 of Fletcher's men in a separate encounter. The confluence of evidence had been overwhelming, leading to a territory-wide manhunt that eventually brought Fletcher himself to justice. "Where will you be stationed next?" Hannah wrote, bringing her thoughts back to the present. "Santa Fe," Foster replied, armies reconsidering its approach to tribal relations after the Fletcher affair. Too many innocents hurt by hasty retribution against the wrong people. He adjusted his uniform jacket uncomfortably. "I've been asked to help implement new protocols for investigating cross-border incidents." Hannah nodded, pleased by this development. Foster had proven himself capable of growth, of reconsidering deeply held assumptions when presented with compelling evidence. Men like him represented hope for more just relations between the different peoples of the territory. She bid him farewell and made her way across the fort's dusty parade ground toward the eastern gate, where Ashki waited with their horses. As the newly appointed Navajo representative to the territorial government, he had his own set of official papers, documents that granted him unprecedented authority to advocate for his people's interests. The changes of the past months had transformed both their lives in ways neither could have imagined when he first found her injured in that ravine. Fletcher's eventual capture and the evidence they had gathered had exonerated the Navajo of numerous attacks previously blamed on them. The territorial governor, facing political pressure after the scandal, had initiated new policies designed to reduce conflict and improve communication between settlers and native nations. "Ready?" Ashki asked as Hannah approached. His English had grown more confident through their work together, just as her understanding of Navajo had deepened. She nodded, mounting her horse, no longer a borrowed mount, but her own dappled mare, a gift from Witsoi after Hannah had helped negotiate water rights for the Navajo's traditional grazing lands. They rode away from Fort Defiance side by side, following the trail that would take them back to the Navajo winter camp in the sheltered valley beyond Shadow Canyon. As the fort receded behind them, Hannah felt the familiar sense of transition, moving between worlds that once seemed irreconcilably separate, but now, through their efforts, had begun to find points of connection. "Strange journey," she wrote. In the small notebook she could now use one-handed while riding, Ashki read her words and smiled. From throne from wagon to respected voice for two peoples. His gaze held hers with warmth that had grown steadily since their shared ordeals. "Not strange, right path." The silver band on Hannah's wrist caught the sunlight, her bride price according to Navajo tradition, though their union represented something unprecedented. A marriage formally recognized by both tribal custom and territorial law. The ceremony 3 weeks ago had been attended by Navajo elders and military officers alike, a visible symbol of the bridge they were attempting to build between cultures. As they crested a rise that offered views of the distant mountains, Hannah reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had led to this moment. The attack that had nearly killed her had instead set her on a path to a life of greater purpose and deeper connection than she had ever thought possible. Her muteness, once seen as a shameful deficiency by her own people, had become almost irrelevant among the Navajo, who valued her quick mind, compassionate heart, and artistic talents far above her inability to speak. The silence that had once isolated her now served as a powerful reminder that understanding could transcend conventional communication. "Shimasani says we return just in time for harvest ceremony," Hannah wrote as they continued their journey. "Yes, Nijoni has prepared your ceremonial dress." Ashki's expression softened with mention of his sister, who had become Hannah's closest friend. "She says your weaving has improved enough that you might start your own blankets soon." Hannah smiled at this milestone. Mastering traditional Navajo weaving was a skill that required years of practice, and being deemed ready to begin her own project represented significant acceptance within the community. The path ahead wound through pinyon, pines, and across high desert plateaus, terrain that had once seemed alien and hostile to Hannah, but now felt increasingly like home. There would be challenges, certainly. Their unprecedented roles as cultural intermediaries would test them both. Some on each side would resist the changes they represented. But as the afternoon sun illuminated the landscape in gold and amber light, Hannah felt a profound sense of rightness. She had lost her voice as a child, lost her family in the wagon attack, lost everything familiar, only to find a deeper voice, a chosen family, and a purpose that transcended the limitations others had placed upon her. Ashki reached across the space between their horses, briefly clasping her hand in his, a gesture that required no words, no writing, no translation. In that touch lay understanding, partnership, and a shared vision for a different future than either culture might have imagined alone. As they rode toward the mountain homeland of the Dine, the people Hannah Reed, once thrown from a wagon, and left for dead, once disguised as a Navajo wife, now a bridge between worlds, carried within her the remarkable truth that sometimes the most profound voice emerges from silence and the most meaningful path begins with a fall. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.